Hi, folks. Our next guest is going to be a famous newsman, and if I could ask people to just come in and have a seat, that would be great. We're excited to have him. My name's Josh Silver. I think most of you were here a moment ago. Some of you are new. I'm the executive director of Free Press. We're a national media reform organization that is working to reform the U.S. media and improve journalism, fight media consolidation, fight for the future of the internet. We invited Dan Rather here today because Dan, over the past several years, has been one of the nation's most outspoken fighters for the kind of critical journalism that I think we're all frustrated is lacking in the United States today. What I want you folks to understand before Mr. Rather takes to the stage is I want you to understand that the media system that we're working with today in the United States is not natural. It's not a media system that was just created by the hand of God, but rather the media system in the United States is created on a set of government policies. They decide who gets access to the TV, radio, and radio dial. They decide who gets free access to lucrative broadcast licenses. And what has happened in the United States over the past several decades is that the media has consolidated enormously into the hands of a few major corporations. And what happens when the media consolidates into the hands of a few major corporations is that journalism suffers. And what I want to make really clear is two things. Number one is that what the media companies do in a consolidated commercial environment is extremely rational. They are not bad people running these media companies. They are good businessmen and women. And they're cutting costs. They're paying attention to the bottom line. They're increasing profits. And what happens when that occurs is newsrooms are closed down and shuttered around the world, which they have been. They lay off journalism staff, both in radio and TV and newsprint. And what we see is the kind of celebritization, is that a word, of the media that has occurred, where you see lots about Britney Spears, O.J. Simpson, Paris Hilton, cheap to cover stories that are not controversial. Because the last part I'm going to leave with you before I turn this over to Dan is you have to understand that media companies are in Washington every day looking for media policy favors worth billions, that's with a B, billions of dollars. And there is a rational incentive for them not to rock the boat and bite the hand that feeds them with policies and politicians and policymakers in Washington. Over the last few years, Dan Rather has done an incredible job both at his show on HDNet and as just a spokesperson talking about the problems that occur in a consolidated commercial media marketplace. And I'm really proud to have been able to work with Dan over the last year or two at Free Press as we really try to work more and more with truth tellers like Dan to expose the problem of journalism and work towards tangible solutions. So without further ado, it is my great honor and privilege to introduce, actually, before I forget, questions. When we do questions for Dan, we're going to ask you to fill them out on note cards. And so you will be passed around note cards when Dan is wrapping up. And while he's speaking, I would ask you to please write down your questions on note cards, and staff are going to gather them. And then our friend Audrey Young is going to read them. So now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dan Rather.
Thank you. Thank you, Josh. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Thank you. First of all, good morning. Thank you all for being here. I don't like to start anything with an apology, and this is not an apology. It's by way of explanation that I'm filling in here this morning for my friend Phil Donahue. Phil was supposed to be here today. A family illness prevented him from being here, so I gladly said that I'd fill in for him. And I'm all doubly delighted to be here in the big tent rather than the Pepsi Center for at least this hour. Don't be alarmed. I don't intend to speak to you for an hour. I also want to thank Josh for that wonderful introduction. Perhaps you know what Abraham Lincoln said about overly generous introductions. He said, never take time to deny it. The audience will find out the truth soon enough for themselves. And so it will be here this morning. I'm sorry that you and I won't have a chance to hear Phil Donahue speak about his remarkable film called Body of War. It's a story of a young veteran, Thomas Young, who enlisted in the Army right after 9/11 to fight in Afghanistan. He wound up fighting in Iraq instead. In Iraq, he was shot and paralyzed after less than a week in the country. What Phil Donahue has done is take his story, document his story. It's a moving story, but not in the usual way one uses that word, usual. It does, to be sure, move one to tears. However you stand on the political spectrum, whatever your partisan political favoritism is or your ideology, it would be very hard to watch this film and not be moved to tears. This is the story of one man's journey from soldier to anti-war activist. It also has the ability to move the viewer to action, so damning in its critique of our institutions and our society's regard for those we ask to fight in our wars. I don't pretend to agree with everything in the film, but I don't think any reasonable person trying to be objective could watch this film and not, number one, be moved by it, and number two, be provoked to new thought about who we are as a people, who we are as a society, as opposed to what our vision of what we could be is. I can't think of any better reminder than Body of War to keep our eyes on the fact that at the base of all the speeches and the music and the pageantry of these conventions lies the bedrock truth that the decisions we make in the political arena and in our daily lives as citizens can have deadly serious consequences for individuals, for institutions, and for our country as a whole. You know the history of these conventions. After the chaos of the 1968 Democratic Convention, the parties started their inexorable moves towards scripting and micromanaging the whole nominating process, but particularly what used to rightly be called the, quote, nominating conventions. We all understand that these conventions no longer nominate anyone. The move was accelerated by the 1976 Republican Convention, where Ronald Reagan almost upstaged and upended incumbent President Gerald Ford, and the 1980 convention, where Ted Kennedy almost did the same to incumbent President Jimmy Carter. These events have evolved since then. They've evolved into infomercials for the parties and for the candidates. Mainstream news outlets acknowledge this as they, especially television, keep cutting back their coverage. Fair enough, but just because the parties lay out a script doesn't mean that reporters and news organizations need to follow that script. There is still plenty of news to cover here. It just needs to be uncovered. And that takes some digging of the kind that has unfortunately gone woefully out of fashion in journalism today. And sure, broadcast and cable news outlets will do a couple of short pieces here and there about how the real story of these conventions is the vast sums of money being raised at private parties all around town. But aside from, in most cases, simply mentioning this fact, they don't follow up on just what that money is going to do to our political system and how. As one reporter, I think the best story here is who gives the big money, to whom, expecting to get what. Now, maybe the coverage does not, for the most part, center on this, because the larger news organizations, of which I was a part for a long time, and it's important to me you understand that I do not accept myself from the criticism inherent in some of the things I'm going to say today. But it may be that in terms of the larger news organizations, that they don't cover stories such as who gives the big money, to whom, expecting to get what, because after all, they are a part of the system. The money raised by the parties and the campaigns for advertising doesn't exactly go to charity. And that's why I'm glad to see all of you here today. Those of you in the new media are afforded a great opportunity to tell the story straight with no chaser, because your bottom line is not tied to the status quo in ways you won't see reported on anybody's evening news. I hope you'll take advantage of the freedom this gives you to report news that is worthy of the name. There is nothing more important, more vital to the democratic process than an independent, a truly and when necessary, fiercely independent press. I use the term press instead of media because I like to recognize the constitutional protections guaranteed to American journalism. Our founding fathers understood that without a free and independent flow of information, government of, by, and for the people didn't stand a chance. That's why they enshrined freedom of the press at the very top of the Bill of Rights in the very First Amendment to the Constitution. I'm reminded of something that Phil Donahue told Bill Moyers about the responsibility of the press when this nation goes to war. Phil said the press needs to, quote, see the pain, don't sanitize the war. If you're going to send young men and women to fight for this nation, tell the truth. That's one of the biggest reasons for the First Amendment, and we haven't been doing this, unquote Phil Donahue. And so he set out to tell the story, the real story of, as he put it, the harm in harm's way. That's what his film is about. In an age when too many of our newsrooms are owned by too few very large international corporate entities, in this age of bottom line values trumping news values, someone needs to stand up for the values of a truly independent press. I think it's worth contemplating that there may be no more independent newsroom than the newsroom of one dedicated person. Citizen journalism, and I don't put that in quotation marks. A lot of people have tried to sort of co-opt the phrase citizen journalism, but without the quotation marks. Citizen journalism holds the promise of investigating and reporting on citizen concerns instead of the pat formulas and set storylines so offered by mainstream news services so many times. Citizen journalism offers a chance to punch through the superficial veneer of vapid campaign coverage. Independent media has a chance to really take people inside America's political process, not through so-called access journalism that purports to give viewers and readers an insider's view by letting the people running the campaigns spin and shout at will, but by getting beneath the words of the David Axelrods and Rick Davises of the world, by not allowing those for whom message discipline is a virtue set the news agenda or determine the news narrative. Let me pause and say that I have great respect for David Axelrod and for Rick Davis, both of whom put together victorious primary and caucus campaigns. But what we're talking about here is what they do for their candidates of necessity. It should be enough to say we recognize their talent. In some cases, yes, they're genius. But we have a different agenda. Theirs is to sell the candidate and the party. Ours, on our best days when we are truly independent and integrity-filled journalists trying to do news that matters, is to get behind the spin, get behind the message discipline, and find out what's really going on. My hope is that we can all bear these things in mind and report in this spirit in the days and weeks ahead at this convention, at the GOP convention, and through Election Day. It is no exaggeration to say that your country needs you, particularly during the next 12 to 13 weeks. Our country needs us because, though it pains me to say it, much of the press, not all, but much of the press has been derelict in its duty too often in recent years. And one more time, I'm going to say I do not accept myself from this criticism. In too much of the mainstream news media, those who wield power are given the opportunity to present their views as a coherent whole to present the narrative of their choosing for our front pages and at the top of news broadcasts, while the views of those without power are represented at best by disparate, editorially unconnected stories buried deep in our newspapers and broadcasts, if indeed they can be found at all. Look, for example, at the run-up to the Iraq War. The vote authorizing the use of force depicted so painfully in Phil Donahue's film Body of War. No matter how much the administration's views may have flown in the face of precedent, established practice, or indeed the facts, the narrative that, quote, Saddam Hussein has weapons of mass destruction and this can't be tolerated in a post-9/11 world, unquote, prevailed. That was the administration's basic narrative. The powerful are given this opportunity still to craft the overarching news narrative in ways big and small, despite what you may hear about the post-Katrina press. But when tough questions are asked and not answered, when reputable people come before the public and say, wait a minute, something's not right here, the mainstream press has too often treated them like voices crying in the proverbial wilderness. The mainstream press has too often given journalists views, airtime, or column inches to put forward the overarching narrative of those in power. They don't dare, perhaps I should say they don't, connect them or make any coherent sense of them, even if the connections should be obvious to journalists, editors, and producers who know the whole story, even if people on the internet and the independent press are making these very same connections. What we have is a disconnect. You have, in one way, a very important and dangerous connect. You have the administration in power, whether it be Democrat or Republican, the administration in power setting the overall narrative of what is most important to our country. In this instance, we're talking about the war. Then you have the mainstream press, much of it, regurgitating that, being an echo chamber for the administration's view of what the overall narrative should be. It isn't enough to say, well, we didn't know, because there was plenty in the independent press and on the internet raising the right questions at the right time. But if it got noticed at all, as I say, it usually wound up at the bottom of page 15 or right at the end of the newscast before they went to important news like how to get a better deal on your summer rental. Now, the mainstream press doesn't dare to do this because someone might then accuse them of editorializing or being the, quote, liberal media. Instead, the task of crafting a coherent narrative out of inconvenient facts is left to some platonic ideal of news consumer, some fictional character who has the time to read the back pages of every newspaper and watch every news program all the way through. What is lost in this failure of nerve is the fact that connecting the dots, making disparate facts make sense, should be a big part of the real work of journalism. In many years of my journalistic career, I've had the pleasure of knowing countless men and women in all media who truly care about news and know how to do it right. Many of these people work still in television, in print, in radio. So, how is it that American journalism finds itself in such a sorry, and I'm sorry to say, watered down state? Let me say directly to you by way of answering that quality news of integrity starts with an owner who has guts. In a news organization with an owner who has guts, there is an incentive to ask the tough question, to connect the dots in a way that makes coherent sense to the news audience. I've been covering politics for more than half a century. I attended my first political convention in 1956, Chicago Democratic Convention, when Adlai Stevenson was renominated for a race that he eventually lost to incumbent President Eisenhower. And yes, a lot of things have changed. Yes, politicians have become more adept, much more adept at holding access over the heads of reporters. Ask too tough a question, or too many of them, so the implicit threat goes, and you're not going to get any more interviews with key political players. But what has changed most is the character of news ownership. I only found out years after the fact, for example, about the pressure that the White House of the late President Richard Nixon put on my then bosses during my coverage of the Watergate crimes. Pressure to cut down the length of the pieces. Pressure to call me off that story, and so on. Because back then, my bosses took the heat, so I didn't have to. They did this so the story could get told and so the public could be informed. This was in the mid-1970s. But it is rare now to find a major news organization owned by an individual, someone who can say, in effect, the buck stops here. I've said it before, I say it again, that now the more likely motto is, the news stops with making bucks. America's biggest, most important news organizations have, over the past quarter of a century, fallen prey to merger after merger, acquisition after acquisition, to the point where they are now tiny parts of immeasurably large international corporate entities. Entities whose primary business often has nothing to do with news. Entities that may at any given time have literally hundreds of regulatory issues before multiple arms of government concerning a vast array of business interests that have nothing to do with news. These are entities that, as publicly held and traded corporations, have as their overall reigning mandate to provide a return on shareholder value, to increase profits, and not over time, not over the long haul, but quarterly, if not on a tighter schedule. One might ask where news fits into this model. And if you really need an answer, you can turn on your television, where I suggest to you, you will quickly see some, if not all, of the following. You will see and hear political analysts reduced to in-studio shouting matches between partisans armed with little more than the day's talking points. Precious time and resources wasted on so-called human interest stories, celebrity fluff, sensational trials, and gossip. So-called political debates, I put it in quotations, where the one thing that is sure not to happen is genuine debates, and where the questions that the public really cares about seldom, if ever, seem to get asked. And you will see and hear international coverage that leaves the American public ignorant of the world outside our borders, unaware of its complexities and the ways that U.S. interests are bound with those of other nations. Does the American news audience know, for one example, that the concern among foreign policy elites in this country over the situation in Georgia has everything to do with major gas and oil pipelines constructed there with U.S. backing against Russian protests? If the American public remains unaware of this fact, in the whole and in the main, after the broad but shallow coverage of recent weeks, ask yourself, who is to blame? I could go on, and I know you'll be relieved to know that I won't, cataloging journalistic sins of which I know you're all too aware. But all of these things, these failings, pretty much come down to this. In the current model of corporate, big international conglomerate corporate ownership, the incentive to produce good and valuable news is simply not there. Good news, news of integrity, requires resources and it requires talent. These things are expensive. These things eat at the bottom line. Years ago, in the 80s and on into the 90s, when the implications of these cost-trimming, I would prefer to say cost-slashing measures, were becoming impossible to ignore, and the quality of news was clearly threatened, I and a few others raised voices against this cutting of news operations to the bone and beyond. Even then, though, I could not have imagined that the cost-cutting imperatives would go as far as they have today, deep into the marrow of what was once considered a public trust. But since the financial resources always seem to be available for entertainment, promotion, and last but not least for lobbying, perhaps there's an even more important reason why the incentive to produce quality news is absent, and that is quality news of integrity by its very nature is sure to rock the boat now and then. Good, responsible news worthy of its constitutional protections will, in that famous phrase, afflict the powerful and confront the afflicted. Comfort. Quality news will not always blow with the prevailing winds. But if we journalists, and I include myself in this criticism for at least the third time, if we are to be worthy of our First Amendment protections, then we should take seriously that famous phrase, afflict the powerful and comfort the afflicted. And that when one feels the need to deliver shareholder value above all, means that good news may not always mean good business, or so goes the fear. The fear is it filters down into just about every big newsroom in the country. There are a lot of fears in newsrooms today. None greater than the fear, if I don't do it a certain way, I'm not going to be here. That's coupled with the fear, and if I don't do it the way the market researchers suggest, or whomever is suggesting it, then this whole operation may not be there. But I would say, and the phrase is not original with me, that fear is not characteristic of the American character, and it certainly should not be characteristic of journalists. Make no mistake, I've spent my entire life in for-profit news, and I happen to think that it does not have to be this way, the way it is now. I have worked for news owners who, while they may have regarded their news divisions as at least an occasional irritant, chose to run that irritant, to turn it into a pearl of public trust. But today, sadly, it seems that the conglomerates that have control over some of the biggest pieces of what is supposed to be a public trust would just as soon spit that irritant out. So what's to be done? It means that we need to be on the alert for where, when, and how our news media bows to undue government influence. When you see it happening, call news organizations, call them out on it. Let them know in no uncertain terms that you won't stand for it. That as news consumers, you are capable of exerting pressure of your own. And as news watchdogs, you are capable of doing the same. It means that we need to continue to let our government know that when it comes to media consolidation, enough is enough. Too few voices are dominating, homogenizing, and marginalizing the news. We, the people, need to demand that the American people get something in exchange for the use of airways that belong, after all, to the people. It means that we need to ensure that the internet, where free speech reigns and where journalism does not have to pass through any corporate filter, remains free. We need to say loud and clear and often that we don't want the biggest corporations enjoying preferred access to or government acting as the gatekeeper for this unique platform for independent journalism. And it means we need to hold the government to its mandate to protect the freedom of the press, including independent and non-commercial news media. You may be saying to yourself, well, it's all well and good for Dan Rather to say this, to say that it matters if we make ourselves known to what's happening with these large conglomerates or with the government, but mine is just one voice, and it gets lost in the waterfall of voices. Not true. In terms of the corporations, I've been there. I've been in the inside. I've been in the rooms where decisions are made. And when the consumers speak, when the audience speaks, when the listeners and viewers speak, particularly if it's more than one or two just trickling in, they do listen. I suggest to you that the stakes could not be higher. The film Body of War serves as a reminder, and the current election season will serve as a test of whether the lessons have been truly learned from the past experience. Ensuring that a free press remains free will require more vigilance than we put forward so far, and it will require more work than we have put forward so far. Ellen Spiro, who co-directed Body of War, has said of this nation's sleepwalk into the war, and I quote her directly, "Let's not let it happen again." Mind you, she was not saying, "Let us not ever go to war again." What she was saying is, let's not sleepwalk into a war. Let's not let that happen again. But as the film itself makes clear, it is happening still as we speak here. Our veterans, wounded in mind and body, are still returning home to inadequate care. In many cases, vastly inadequate care. Our unwounded veterans are still being cycled through multiple tours of duty. And too much of the press, instead of fiercely defending our constitutional prerogatives, that is, the constitutional prerogatives of the people for a free and independent press operating with freedom of the press, and by the extension to the liberties of the American people, much of the press is rolling over and playing dead. American journalism is in need of a spine transplant. Let the treatment begin today with those of you in this room. You can take this message home with you. You can take it back to your desks and your workplaces, to your colleagues and your fellow citizens. Magnify it, multiply it, and spread it. Make it something that cannot be ignored, not by the political parties, not by our candidates, not by the owners and executives of media companies. Write these people, call these people, send them the message that you know your rights. You know that you are entitled to news media as diverse and varied as the American people, and that you deserve a press that provides the raw material of democracy, the good information that Americans need to be full participants in our government of, by, and for the people. And most of all, show them with your example what a truly independent press looks like, because your country needs you now more than ever. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Please. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. We're going to take questions. Unfortunately, it'll be for a fairly short time. I have a plane to catch this afternoon. I know you've heard that before. It's a common excuse. But in this case, as Dr. Henry Kissinger once said in another context, in this case, it has the advantage of being true. But we'll take as many questions as we can fold. What's the procedure? You're going to give us questions, or you're going to say the questions? Yeah. These are questions that are written from the audience.
That's right. That's
okay,
right.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. We got a lot of really great questions here, and we're really not going to have time to do all of them, but let's start off with 2 or 3 and see how far we get.
Okay, good.
We're very pressed on time for the agenda as well. And I beg forgiveness on handwriting issues here. Here's the first one. I think it's fair to say that those with wealth and power have attempted to influence the media since the beginning of time. How, in your experience, has this game changed during your professional career? And what key things, say top 3, could bring more balance to mainstream media?
Well, as to the first, the big difference is that their influence, that is, the influence of those who have, in the words of the, I have it up here, that's good, in the words of the questioner, those who have wealth and power, who seek to influence the information flow. Not everybody who's wealthy, not everybody in power seeks to do so, but those who seek to do so have increased their power. With each succeeding year, their power grows. Your power, that is, the power of the people, diminishes. No small part of this has been the accelerating tremendous influence of special interest money in politics, that is to say elective politics, in the legislative process, and in the regulatory process. So it's true that people of wealth and power have tried from the beginning. But not so long ago, people in the press, including, as I tried to point out in my scratched out remarks here, the people who owned news organizations didn't allow them to have the kind of influence. Number two, those people in the press resisted it. They were far less afraid to speak up, to speak out, and to make a point of saying this isn't right. And number three, as recently as 25 or 30 years ago, it was accepted by people who own, particularly those who own the largest media outlets, that a public journal was a public trust, and that while they wanted to make money, and because of their license for radio or television, they had a license to make money, that their responsibility to meet the obligations of the public trust were great, and that the urge was very small to get over that line of trust. And what was different, they knew if they got over that line of not meeting their responsibilities to the public trust, that they would pay a price for it. So what's changed, to the questioner, and that's a big change, it's a change in the attitude of both consumers and those who produce the news product. Now, the second half of the question was, name three things that are the worst. I sometimes suffer news timer's disease, and this is one of those times, so I'll have to go back to these three.
Well, I think you answered a little bit, but what are three top things that could bring more balance to mainstream media?
Well, three top things, and this is not an all-inclusive list. One is awareness, to speak out and to say, hell no, we're not going to allow this current situation to happen. Two, some way has to be found to first slow, because that's the best we can do, but secondarily stop the influence of the combined effort of very large media companies and the powerful in Washington. They have greater influence in more newsrooms today than they've ever had. That has to stop, and that has to be reversed. There should be a so-called wall of separation, or if you want to call it airspace, between the corporate entity, no matter how large and powerful it is, between that corporate entity and the newsroom, there needs to be some airspace, or if you will, a wall. And with people on the corporate side, particularly the owners, I want to echo something that John said before. We've talked a lot about the owners of media companies. These are not bad people. They care as much about the country as we do. They are, in many cases, outright patriots. They want to do the right thing. It's just that their definition of the right thing has become service to the bottom line, shareholder value. It is not what are my responsibilities to the public trust that I hold in the public journal that I own. I think the third thing would be, and this puts the onus on every consumer of news, is to be more aware. I've criticized myself and others in journalism. I've criticized the owners of particularly the largest media companies. But the audience itself, the consumers of news, have to bear some responsibility because they've been too docile. I'm an optimist by experience and by nature. And I've never subscribed to the idea that to be a good journalist, you need to be cynical. I've never subscribed to the idea that to be an alert citizen, you need to be cynical. Cynicism, no, but skepticism, yes. The core of being a good journalist is to be skeptical, to say, okay, that's what they say is going on in there, but what the hell is really going on behind? That's skepticism. And as a consumer, we talked about, well, what are the three things that need to change? Consumers have got to get more alert and have got to be more skeptical about what they're being told, what they're seeing, who's behind putting that on the air at that time in that way. Those are the three big things.
Here's another one, and it comes from Brent Green, who says he's a follower since the 1960s.
I appreciate that.
Please explain why major media coverage of the horrors of war have not been shared with Americans during the Iraq War in a manner reminiscent of the Vietnam War? What if contemporary war coverage had been as graphic? Would we still be fighting in Iraq?
Well, I can't answer the last of that. Would we still be fighting in Iraq? As to the first, it is true that the images out of Iraq and Afghanistan, major fields of combat, please note that these wars have now gone on longer than World War II. But there are two reasons why the coverage, battlefield coverage, has not been as graphic in these wars as was the case in Vietnam and previous wars. One is access of reporters to frontline combat units is far more limited than it was during the Vietnam War. Another time, another place, maybe over an adult beverage, I'll tell you how it was in Vietnam as compared to now. But we don't have time for that. But just the access reporters had in Vietnam was enormous compared to the access they have today. Now, it is not true that no reporters, no news organizations are allowed to cover frontline combat. Point is, it's much more controlled by the Defense Department, that is the civilian control of the Defense Department and the White House, and the military, than it was in the Vietnam War. Some in the military, by no means all, believe they learned a lesson out of the Vietnam War about war coverage. From my viewpoint, one person's opinion, they learned the wrong lesson. They thought the lesson was, and there's still people very high in the Pentagon and certainly people in the political apparatus in the White House who say, if you don't show the public how really brutal war is, how savage it is, you stand a much better chance of keeping public opinion behind the war. Therefore, you have much more limited access for reporters now. The whole embed process policy, which was an improvement on Gulf War I, the embed policy in Gulf War II, I would include Afghanistan in this, still limits reporters. One important way, for example, it limits reporters. You get embedded with the unit, you have to go where that unit goes. You cannot stay behind and see what the result of their operation just was in most cases. But I don't want to get too deep into it. The second thing is that by conscious decision, the current administration, for the first time in American history, made a concerted and tremendous effort. There have been some efforts before. They made a big effort not to show bodies coming home. You can count on the fingers of one hand and still, I think, have some surplus of the times you have seen flag-draped coffins coming back by the dozens, arriving in an Air Force base. The reason is it's off limits for coverage. This was a conscious decision. It was, if people begin to see the flag-draped caskets coming back, and if people begin to see too many pictures of young men and women without their legs, without their eyes, unable to see, then people will start turning against war. Excuse me. So these are conscious decisions. It has to do with the manipulation of the media, with controlling the message. The message from the top. We talked about the overarching narrative. The narrative is, yes, war is terrible. Yes, war is bad. No, we didn't want to go to the war. But behind that is, we don't want to show you just how savage it is, how brutal it is on all sides. We don't want to show you what it's doing to our young people. We don't want to show you what it's doing to the other side's young people. We don't show you what it's doing to refugees and other civilians by the tens of thousands. So the difference is, at the very top, the powerful are now emboldened to say, we control the message, we control the narrative, and we are in many important ways going to sanitize the war. I will not say it's that simple. I will say to you, when you think about it, it's a fairly direct line. Yes, ma'am.
This has to be our last question, and it's a tough one, but we got it. Quite a number of this same question, so we'll go with this one.
If it's a tough question, I need to go.
Well, no, it's not that tough. What's the answer if it's not a corporate news model? Is it a non-profit media organization, government funded, What are the alternatives to corporate media?
Well, first of all, I think you need all of it. The most important piece is to get those who own the largest media companies, to get them voluntarily, but if not voluntarily, otherwise, to go back to the model that said news is in the public interest. You can also make it in the corporate interest to make a profit. I subscribe to the idea that good, quality, integrity-filled news can make a profit. But in those three things, it was, well, what do we do about the large media companies? What about nonprofits? What about government funding news? I have some difficulty with government-funded news because it just makes the hair on the back of my neck stand up a little bit. But if there is built-in proper checks and balances to make sure that, again, the most powerful people in government, in concert with the most powerful media companies, don't dictate to the government-funded news, I can buy it. But one of the points I tried to make in the speech, we need more diversity. We need more radio stations that are owned by African Americans, by people of Hispanic descent, by Native Americans. We need that kind of diversity, and we need diversity in news outlets. But the reality of today is what we need most are a few, and I think it would only take a few, owners of the very largest media outlets to have a spine transplant, to have guts, to have say, I'm here to make a ton of money for myself and for my stockholders, but I subscribe to the idea that news is a public service and a public trust. Now, some of you, at least mentally, may be shaking your heads in the negative, saying, either Dan Rather is more naive than I ever thought he was, or he's saying something that even he does not believe. Well, the first of that may be true. You'd have to judge. To the second, I do believe that the quickest answer to some of the most important problems in journalism are owners who will see the newsroom as a public trust and who are dedicated to meet the responsibility of that trust and have the guts to do it. Folks, I got to fly, got to be on my way. Thank you very much for your attention. Thanks.